afternoon and welcome to our workshop. My name is Alexandria Ramos and I am part of Gabe's team. Today, I, along with my colleague Elba Solis, will be supporting you with any questions you may have by monitoring the chat box throughout our session. I am excited to now introduce our presenter, Sandra Mercuri and Sandra Musanti, and our special guest, Elena Esquer. For this workshop, thank you and have a wonderful session. Please note that your microphones are muted so that this way there's no interruptions while the presenter is presenting. Also, the presenter will not answer questions during the presentation, but if time permits, there may be a couple of questions at the end of the presentation. If you're struggling with any technical issues, please feel free to message us in the chat and we'll see how we can assist you. Also, at the end of the session, there will be a survey and you can find the link in the chat box toward the end. Thank you and have fun.
So welcome everyone. My name is Elena Esquer and I am the Region 5 representative on the CABE Board of Directors. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today our featured speakers for this session, Dr. Sandra Mercuri and Dr. Sandra Musanti. Dr. Mercuri is the CEO of Sandra Mercuri Educational Consultants and a nationally recognized educational consultant, researcher, and author in second language acquisition, dual language education, and curriculum integration for biliteracy development. Her research focuses on the development of academic language across the content areas, language transfer, and the effect of long-term professional development on bilingual and ESL teachers' instructional practices. Dr. Mercuri is the author of numerous publications, including the book, Supporting Literacy Through Science, The Challenge of Teaching Science in a Time of Accountability. Welcome. I also have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sandra Musanti, who is an associate professor in the Department of Bilingual and Literacy Studies at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Mathematics Education for Latinos and Latinas. Her areas of expertise are pre-service and in-service teacher education. Presently, her research explores bilingual development in STEM areas and translanguaging pedagogies, focusing on culture and equity issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Mercuri and Dr. Sandra Musanti. Thank you.
Well, thank you for introducing us. We're going to share our screen and well, thank you for being with us today. You know, we know it's Friday, it's in the evening, and so we are very honored that you are here with us. Today, we're going to present the work that we have been doing for a book, La enseñanza en el aula bilingüe, Content, Language, and Biliteracy, published by Caslon. And this is part of the work that really shows the application of the biliteracy construct in classroom practice.
So it's very exciting to be here to share the work we've done through, you know, more like around 3 years with my colleague, Sandra Mercuri. We are both from Argentina, but we also collaborated with Alma Rodriguez, who is a colleague, then the Dean of the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And so we were colleagues for some time at the university, and we started to envision this book. And as we envisioned this book, we identified some goals. What we thought, what do we want the teachers and pre-service teachers or administrators who engage with this book, who start to interact and grapple with this book to get. And among those goals were these that are listed here and in the preface of the book, to explain how diverse bilingual learners learn content through 2 languages at school, to identify and build on the content, language, and biliteracy resources and assets that bilingual learners bring with them to the classroom, to use an interdisciplinary biliteracy framework that we're going to describe a little bit, to design instruction that targets high content and language standards, goals, objectives, and outcomes, to choose content and language and biliteracy instructional and assessment strategies that leverage students' bilingualism for learning, and ultimately to tap into students' complex linguistic repertoires to develop and extend their language practices in oral and written Spanish and English. So we worked with this understanding that translanguaging pedagogy is a pathway to social justice. That means understanding that language and the bilingual repertoire, the enriched and complex linguistic repertoire from our students is a resource for learning, but it's also a right for us that the students have to access that repertoire for learning content. So this means that when we teach from this perspective, we are not adding one language to another. We are not adding English to Spanish, but we are using a flexible language pedagogy that integrates hybrid practices in a very strategic manner. And this is a key idea that we are going to kind of reinforce and explain through this presentation, because only in a strategic manner we can really value and leverage a student's linguistic repertoire. So ultimately, what we want to accomplish is to build a student's dynamic bilingual repertoire by adding new linguistic features to those that the students already have in both languages. This means that when we encounter our students, we understand and we value all the assets they bring, all the linguistics knowledge they have, and the richness of their fluidity in which they use them to communicate and make meaning. Because translanguaging is about that. It's about understanding and valuing the dynamic ways in which bilingual people, individuals, use language to make meaning and communicate meaning. But a translanguaging pedagogy is using that knowledge in a strategic way, an intentional way, to as a resource for learning and teaching. So what we are proposing is this book is an understanding of biliteracy as interdisciplinary. So we define interdisciplinary biliteracy as a dynamic and holistic process in which literacy practices intertwine, like the picture shows, and are enacted across content areas. So this means that we don't understand biliteracy as something we develop separate from the content area learning, but integrated. So in addition, we need to understand biliteracy as a multidirectional process, no more like we develop literacy in L1 and that transfers to L2, but a multidirectional process. So this means that our students are going to have different biliteracy development trajectories, not just one way of developing biliteracy. And this is very important to understand and to develop instruction that is intentional, designed to support those different trajectories. So then what we want to highlight as the teaching for interdisciplinary biliteracy in the bilingual classroom is both strategic and intentional. And these are two non-negotiables. So strategic because it has to be responsive to students' needs to learn content and develop language. So that's the way we need to conceive the instruction and what we propose our students in terms of how to transact learning. And intentional because we need to clearly identify purposes. So when we engage in thinking of translanguaging spaces to teach our students, we are going to do it with a clear purpose. So because what we ultimately want is to leverage on students' linguistic repertoire. So, and you're going to see through the examples how what we are proposing entails to provide multiple opportunities to read and write, reading different fiction and nonfiction texts in both languages, also reading and writing different type of texts independently or in collaboration with the teacher or with other students in both languages at different times, of course, but also participating in multiple opportunities to engage in academic conversations, in oral discussions about content using languages, using their full linguistic repertoire, or at times one language or the other. And also in this way, making possible to integrate content, language, and literacy practices using the 4 language domains to demonstrate content knowledge across both program languages.
So we want to move into more the practical applications of these theoretical underpinnings that really are at the core of what we want to convey through the book and across all the different chapters. So one of the important aspects of translanguaging pedagogy that we demonstrate through the amazing teachers that we portrayed in the book and their work is cross-linguistic connections as 3 levels of academic language. So what is academic language? Academic language is the language of school, is the language of the text, is the language of the assessment, is that discourse that is a very complex thing to teach and to learn because it has multiple layers. So it has the vocabulary layer that is not just content specific vocabulary, more technical, but it's also the general academic and the transition or signal words. We also have the sentence level, the grammatical complexity of different type of sentences, and also the discourse level or text level is how the kids navigate and understand text structure across different genres. So we try to give teachers examples of how they can address text level, but even at more advanced with the cross-linguistic connection. So for example, if the teachers have been teaching a particular type of text structure in one language, through a cross-linguistic connection, having the text side by side that I'm going to show you in an example, they don't have to reteach text structure in the other language. They just bring the other language together. They analyze 2 texts side by side, and they actually co-construct this biliteracy understanding through those metalinguistic conversations. So for example, at the text level, in this example, the students will interact with complex texts across genres in both languages. And in this case will be language arts and science. We also, the students can interact with text with different complexity and ways to organize and present information on the subject. At the sentence level, the students understand and practice a variety of grammatical structures to access the academic content. And at the vocabulary level, again, they can do content, general or signal words. They can use it and understand how words are formed, prefixes, suffixes, how they move from for a verb to a noun to an adjectives, and understand really through word studies how the languages are developed through that lens. So the example that I'm sharing with you is based on these 2 texts, El impacto del cambio climático, the impact of climate change. We acknowledge that these books are transadapted or translated. This one of the book is not an authentic text, but for the purpose of the analysis, it really gives the students access to academic language of the content area in the 2 languages. So from the translanguaging lens, it is important that teachers stay in the language of instruction to model the language, but the students are able to negotiate meaning and understanding as they look at these 2 texts side by side, and some may be talking in English, some may be talking in Spanish, but really what is important is that the more that they engage in these linguistic conversations, the better will be for the students to really understand how these 2 languages work and what is the same and what is different. So the teacher uses these 2 books to analyze the structures of persuasive and cause and effect. They guide the students first in understanding author's purpose, but also guides the students in the analysis of selected pages side by side. And the goal here is really to focus on how the thesis, argument, and conclusion in this persuasive text is structured. So, for example, here the teacher assigns the students in bilingual pairs to look at the text side by side on page 11. And in page 11 is where the thesis states. And then she also have them look at the other pages to see how really the thesis develops, considering different arguments throughout the text, and presents the reader the main idea of the text and the objective. So the way that the text is organized, those parts appears in the same way in both texts. The teacher also guides the students to move to the next page. And here is where they start looking at the arguments and how the argument is developed in the paragraph that follows, the thesis, and serve the support for that thesis in a way to convince the reader that what the thesis states is correct. So I think there is also important to consider the 4 language domains here, because the students are definitely reading, going back, rereading parts of the text. There is a lot of oracy developed because the kids are talking about what they find, what they explore, but also they need to write their findings. They need to have textual evidence. So they are also writing. So these activities, this very strategic way of planning for interdisciplinary biliteracy should also target the 4 language domains. And finally, the conclusion integrates the arguments that support the initial thesis. So this is how the teacher guides the student through this mini lesson. In other lessons, this is just for one day. We know that cross-linguistic connections really require a lot of knowledge about the languages. So that should not be a long lesson. So the teacher could plan in a series of mini lessons using the same text, but to look at the text with different lenses. So this particular mini lesson was on text structure. So the next level of academic language that this teacher used was for the sentence level. And at the sentence level, some of the things that the teacher looked at was punctuation, capitalization rules, how sentences begin with capital letters and end with periods, that both languages use a comma after transition words in beginning positions, such as sin embargo, nevertheless. Also, both languages capitalize proper nouns. But they also engage in a discussion why the name of the foundation was also in English in the Spanish text. And so it was a very rich discussion because that was the name of the foundation. So even in the Spanish text, it was not translated. So the goal of these metalinguistic conversations is really has multiple layers. It's not only understanding text structure from a literacy lens, it's also the developing of academic language, but it's also going deeper in understanding of the content. Other aspects of the sentence level that the teacher addressed was, for example, analyzing the sentence grammatical complexity and explaining, for example, that the noun and adjective are placed in different order. Combustibles fósiles, fossil fuels. Hogares seguros, safe homes. Aire puro y agua limpia, clean air and water. Identify differences in the use of grammatical structures. For example, hacer perforaciones en busca de combustibles fósiles. We need to say to drill for fossil fuels. So there is not one-to-one literal translation. And that is also important for students to understand how the author uses the language to convey the same meaning. And also they discuss in the use of the omitted subject in the Spanish that does not exist in English. And that is a particular feature of the Spanish language that students need to understand, especially in dual language classrooms. This is a difficult concept for the English speakers learning Spanish. In Spanish, we don't need the personal pronoun or the subject because the ending of the verb conjugation is telling us who is doing the action of the verb. But in English, for example, if you said, I walked, he walked, she walked, the verb stays the same. So we do need the subject to know who is doing the action of walking. So that is something important that we need to bring to the students' attention, because it has an implication for writing when they do their own writing or they write about what they read. So, for example, ha permitido a las empresas. ¿Quién ha permitido? El gobierno. So here in English, we do have the subject. It has allowed businesses. And the last layer that this teacher addressed in other lessons is at the vocabulary level. So the first and probably the most common cross-linguistic connection at vocabulary level that we always see in classroom is at the cognate level. Teachers use cognates that are identical at the semantic level. They mean the same thing, but they also have similarities or morphological and orthographic equality. For example, fossil and fossil, decade and década, emissions, emisiones, climate, climático, arguments, argumentos. But there are other aspects that the teachers could also extend. For example, morphological patterns. You're looking at predictive variations of nouns, in this case, generation and generación, protection and protección, or, for example, predictable variations of adverbs, indirectly and indirectamente. So there are multiple layers that one text could allow the teacher and the student to engage in these translanguaging practices to really facilitate the understanding of how these two languages work, what is the same, what is different, but at the same time, because they are coming back to the text with different lenses, they also improve reading fluency, they can write better, and they definitely understand the content at a deeper level. Another example that we wanted to share is that the PVR as translanguaging pedagogy in the upper grade levels. That's an example that we wanted to provide, because we sometimes feel that PVR is seen more as a strategy for the lower grades, but this is a very valuable and effective strategy for older students too. So in this case, when you apply preview, view, and review for content access, you're definitely in a very intentional and strategic way. You are leveraging on the student's linguistic repertoire. You are intentionally previewing the content that the students need to learn in one language. Then you do the lesson in the other language. So because you already scaffold that for the students in the preview, the teacher stays in the language of instruction without concurrent translation. And in the review, the teacher comes back again to the home language of the student to clarify misconceptions, to extend the work. So the students are navigating one big idea, one probably task or project, but they are doing it in a very intentional way across three instances where the two languages are used. But I wanted to clarify that this is not concurrent translation. This is the teacher does a mini activity in one language, then the teaches the main part of the lesson in the other language, and then does a quick review or continues with a review the next day, for example, with an extended activity. So hopefully this example will kind of bring to life this. So in this case, I put it in order what I'm going to walk you through. Through the preview, the teacher builds vocabulary to enhance comprehension. And then during the view is when the teacher reads a particular book, introduces the concept of point of view, because it's what she's going to use for a writing activity. It also introduces signal words that will facilitate compare and contrast writing. That was going to be the type of writing that she wants to model for the students. And then in the review, she models the text. She actually writes the text with the students. So she scaffold and build towards that review that it was going to be the next day in the language, in the other language. And at the end of the writing, the students read it with the teacher and also analyze the structure of the newly created text. She also asked the students to identify the grammatical structures that are created with the transition word for compare and contrast. So the teaching is directly connected to the activity across these three spaces: the preview, the view, and the review. So the preview begins with a gallery walk. So the teachers, this is on the Native Americans, and so the students are looking at all these visuals, and the teacher introduced the key vocabularies of settlements, ceremonies, and nomads. But the students, using post-it notes, they can add those vocabularies in Spanish that they know. They can also add questions that they may have, a response to the visuals that they, as they go through the gallery walk. So it's really, the purpose is for oral language development and building background knowledge. Then the next step is moving into the view or Vista. And this is where the teacher used a mentor text, Encuentro by Jane Yolen. And really the text is to introduce the point of view and analyze the text structure with them. So the discussion of the point of view is because they had been reading the textbook that has the point of view of the historian, but now this book is from the point of view of a Taino Indian little kid that look at the ships and look at the conquerors with a complete different view that is being presented by the historian. So during this analysis of the text is also where after that the teacher introduces also the transition words, because she wants them to understand how the discursive patterns are created using these connectors. And then the review is where the teacher actually builds from the reading, the discussion, the introduction of the transition words, now moves into the writing. So there is, again, the 4 language domains: a lot of talking, a lot of reading, a lot of writing. The teacher facilitates the writing and the students are actively involved. And this is an interactive writing, so the kids can come and share the pen, taking turns creating the text. And the students are also writing in their notebooks, writing together with the teacher. So this is the collaborative writing sample. The historical event presents the facts. So while the historical event, a historical text presents the facts from the point of view of the conquerors, the fictional text presents the data from the point of view of the Taino, native Taino. Furthermore, the texts are different in the way the authors describe Native Americans and conquerors. The only similarity between the text is that the two texts focus on the same historical event. So after they co-created with the students, the teacher invited them to actually identify those transition words that had been introduced in the view part. Even though they were in Spanish, they also did the cross-linguistic connection. So they were equipped with the vocabulary to actually go and write those in English.
So now we are just wanted to share briefly, because we don't have much time, an example from the lower grades. So for those of you who are wondering, we are presenting material that is in this book that we wrote together, La enseñanza en el aula bilingüe. The book has been written completely in Spanish, mostly in Spanish, from a translanguaging perspective. I'm going to say something else at the end. But what we want to share briefly also is the importance to provide multiple opportunities to reading and writing using this approach, translanguaging pedagogy, to leverage students' bilingualism, also in the lower grades. And in this case, it's from a lesson, from a second grade lesson, focused on exploring the environment and the animals' habitats, and so on. In this particular case, ¿cuáles son las características de los animales de acuerdo con su hábitat? And these teachers identified 2 objectives, 2 content and language objectives. One focused on describing orally and in writing, the characteristics of the animals and their habitats, using academic language and specific vocabulary and adjectives, and especially descriptive phrases. And the other objective is to compare and contrast cognates, identifying similarities and differences in terms of morphology for those particular terms. And I'm going to provide an example. The teacher focuses in this case in providing opportunities to read, to do interactive reading of two different informational texts. So they learn about this topic in Spanish learning and looking at the images in the book. And then there are opportunities for them to share their ideas about the text using both languages. So they access the content in Spanish, they have conversations among themselves and with the teacher in English or in both languages. So, and the focus is for the students to describe the characteristics of the animals and their habitats. So in this particular activity, the teacher focuses on talking in science. So the focus is to use their linguistic repertoire to discuss the content. And so the teacher is using different images, presents different images, and the students engage in think, pair, and share to discuss the characteristics and to identify the habitat of these different animals. And they do so using their full linguistic repertoire. So because the focus is on content and to identifying the characteristics of the animals and using their full linguistic repertoire to do so. So what ultimately happened afterwards is the teacher focuses on building the Spanish content academic vocabulary. And this is what I was saying at the beginning, that is, it's important that we purposefully and intentionally design activities to add new features, new linguistic features to one or the other language. And in this case, we are going to focus on academic Spanish vocabulary. And the students are going to use and organize in this table different, what they know about the pato, the jirafa, the delphine, and identifying their habitats. So they are adding this vocabulary. And they are also working on adding vocabulary to define the characteristics of these animals in terms of what they eat, omnívoro, herbívoro, carnívoro. And at the same time, the teacher can work on certain features of the language in Spanish, like the use of accents. So on how to use the accent marks and some rules about that. So what comes after is a focus on cross-linguistic connection that Sandra was explaining before. Of course, targeting the cognates that in this case are part of this lesson on animals, and introducing a new feature of the English language, that is a herbivore, carnivore, and omnivore. So what we see here is how the students are enriching their knowledge of the standard use of Spanish and how words are formed and how accents work, but also at the same time, in connection to that, they introduce new features of the English language when they add the knowledge of these cognates, and they start comparing and contrasting the differences and similitudes. For instance, identifying, well, they all end the same, so they understand the way the suffix works and the meaning attached to the suffix. In this case, what they eat, what the animals eat is the meaning. And then they identify the difference in the root of the word and how that relates to what type of animals, what do the animal eat. So this is a way in which translanguage in pedagogy works intentionally and purposefully and strategically to build on the students' linguistic repertoire and to enhance their understanding of standard features of both languages. So this is the reason what we proposed is this understanding of interdisciplinary biliteracy as a socially just approach to achieve educational equity. Because ultimately it's about developing the complex linguistic repertoire of bilingual students across content areas, and also create intentional and strategic interlinguistic spaces in different content areas through the implementation of a translanguage in pedagogy. And in this case, today we emphasize the importance to teach interlinguistic connections at the word, sentence, and text level, not just the word level, to develop metalinguistic awareness, which is an ability that can be used in many different contexts and situations, and also integrate strategies such as the preview view review that Sandra described, because allows for both languages to use purposefully in learning content, and design integrated opportunities to read and write and discuss different types of texts across content areas and language. So this same idea, this same conceptualization of translanguage in pedagogy we used to write the book. The book, we wrote it in Spanish, but we wanted to provide access to the bilingual individuals that might engage with the book. And that's the reason part of the, we have a preface that is in English for those who are not very well versed in Spanish but want to know about this book and how it can be used. And also each chapter has an introduction in English and a review in Spanish. So in a way to model what we are proposing in this book. So maybe there is a little time for questions and answers.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.